I'm already getting the pronunciations wrong before you started.
The funny thing about my name is, if you say it properly, it's an Indian name and it's more like Ravi. But it feels very strange to me to say my name in an Indian accent when nothing else I say comes out in an Indian accent. So for all my life, I've said Ravi, and it's, I'm happy with that. So thanks for the effort.
Okay. I'll try and do better with the protagonist of your book.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's lovely to see you. How are you doing today? You well?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yeah, it's Friday. We're looking forward to the nice hot weekend here, and hopefully get a little pool time or something in.
You've got good weather over there, have you? Because ours is a bit cloudy at the moment.
Yeah, it's cloudy, but I think it's going to clear up, and summertime is always nice, especially in Northeast America, because you've gone through so many months of winter that just being able to go outside in shorts and a t-shirt is that much more of an experience that you appreciate and enjoy.
100%.
That's one thing I like about living here.
Yeah, and for us in England, it's officially Mask Day. So I don't know if you've heard.
No, I hadn't.
But officially from today, you have to wear a mask in all shops, I believe. So
yeah,
not great if the weather's hot, but for the greater good. So yeah, I've just finished reading your incredible book, Terodros the King, and I finished it on Wednesday. I really enjoyed it. I think it's brilliant, and it was very, very refreshing for me actually to read some fiction, actually, because I sometimes you get caught in a loop of reading non-fiction, and it was just very refreshing to be able to read some fiction for a change. Do you find that a little bit, or do you dabble in both?
I'm more of a fiction reader myself. Reading non-fiction feels a bit like school to me, that it's something somebody's making me read. And reading for me, I want to get away from the everyday. I want to get away from, the technical reading I have to do at work. And so I usually turn to fiction. I'm reading Moby Dick right now just because I'd never gotten around to it. And yeah, it's fantastic.
Right, I haven't read that. I need to add that to my list. Would you say that reading fiction, or are there any fiction works in particular that inspired your recent book?
So my inspiration for the book was actually the historical event itself, the story that happened, that some king in Ethiopia kidnapped British envoys, that the reaction from the United Kingdom was to send this massive army with 44 elephants and 10,000 men to go and completely annihilate this guy, and send a message that the British Empire is not to be trifled with. But that story has always been told from the perspective, I think, at least from what I've seen, the perspective of the British people that are going and doing the invading. And so that's really driven the narrative, and it's sort of tied into that broader narrative of the British Empire itself, which is, how do we justify colonialism, that we've gone and oppressed all these people around the world and ruled over them? How do you justify that? And a big part of that, of course, is if you're going to impress somebody and feel good about yourself for doing it, you've got to other that person. You've got to make them subhuman. You've got to call them a savage, or paint them as something less than yourself, that you can go and save them, you can go and make their lives better. And so that's that weight of all the writing that's been done about this, I think, has colored the way the story has been told. And I wanted to turn that on its head and tell it in a completely different way. So I wanted my cultural representation of the Black characters in the story to be that they were sophisticated, intelligent, elegant, dignified, that they used non-violent means to achieve their goals, that they, were driven by higher ideals, and, that they were actually more civilized than the people that were coming to ravage their land. So that was kind of my inspiration and what I was trying to do with the story. So, with fiction, it's a lot easier to do that, because when you're writing nonfiction, as I learned the hard way in university, I would write a paper where I was there to think. I wanted to think. I wanted to express what I was thinking. I'd turn in a paper and I'd get it back, and it's, the marks wouldn't be that great. And they'd say, "Oh, we thought you you're very clever. You've written something interesting, but you didn't cite any sources. You've got to essentially learn to regurgitate some of what's already been written in order for your kind of nonfiction or academic paper to stand up to scrutiny or to be taken seriously." And here, what are all the sources for this historical event that I have access to? They're written by the white men who participated in the event. And of course, they're going to have a bias to paint themselves as the heroes, the ones that acted righteously, and that, the outcomes of what happened historically were due to whatever they did or they acted as. And so if I wrote a nonfiction account of this event, immediately I think the challenge would be, well, you've contravened what we can see in all these historical sources of what actually happened, so it invalidates the way you've told the story. But with fiction, I had the freedom to do that. I had the freedom to write a story where the Africans are the heroes, and present a counter narrative, which, without those cultural representations of Black people, of Africans, I think it's going to be impossible for us to fight the unconscious biases that still exist in our society. The othering that still exists. I think if you've got a massive amount of literature through history that has a cultural representation of Black people in a certain way that served a certain purpose historically, that's what people have access to. That's what people read. It's going to become ingrained in their subconscious. It's going to kind of be part of how they think about the world, how they think about certain people, whether they know it or not. And yeah, I think the only way to fight that is to put media out there, to put fiction, film, anything you name out there that puts the country cultural representation up for dissemination, and so people can engage with that, take that in, and the next time they look at an Ethiopian person, the next time they look at any Black person, they might think to themselves that they could be someone different than what I've historically been told that they are. Yeah. So that was the project.
Yeah, and I think you succeeded and some. And what I thought was really interesting is that you also incorporate the perspective of the colonialists and the British. But I feel like you did it in a way that, because we often like to see the world in black and white, but I think actually you were quite sensitive to the inner workings of the British Empire as well, and I think that actually helps to strengthen the alternative perspective of the Africans. Was that at all in your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to go too far the other way and just say, it was all about the Africans and they were the only ones that were the historical agents causing these events to take place the way they did. Obviously it was all of them together, and they each equally contributed to how history happened. So, let's not be guilty of the same thing, of denigrating the white people that were part of this. They had the same capacity for good and bad, and for admirable qualities and inadmirable qualities that the Black people did, and it all came together in a way that as you said, I tried to keep that balance, which is a fine line to walk, but that's definitely part of where I came from. And myself as well, my father's white and my mother's a person of color, so I've got to deal with that tension in myself as well every day. And I think doing it in the book was almost a way to think about it in myself as well.
And do you think perhaps, because I sometimes feel like I've got mixed heritage as well, do you think that sometimes offers you a unique perspective that maybe others can't provide in every scenario?
Maybe so. there's sort of an unsaid question here, which is, I'm not a black guy, but I'm writing about these black guys. What gives me the right to do that, right? And so, you start unpacking issues of identity, and it's not as simple as it seems. It really isn't black and white. And I don't think that I uniquely, being of mixed heritage, you know, that doesn't uniquely qualify me to talk about this any more than as if I was black, as if I was white, as if I was anything else. But I think maybe what I do have that gives me the ability to speak to some of these issues is, okay, I'm not black, but I grew up in Haiti. I grew up in Ethiopia. Everyone was black. That was just who people were. I, as a person of color, have experienced some of the same issues and discrimination that many black people in America face as well. I would go to the U.S. Embassy overseas, and the security guard wouldn't let me in the door because I didn't look like I belonged. I would fly back to America, come through customs, and there would be a line of basically African and other people of color taken off to the side for screening, look through their suitcase. I would go in that line, not in the line with all the other, people that got to just sail through customs. I do feel like I have some personal experience with issues that affect people of color. I think I've also been privileged enough to feel that I can maybe even understand how I might have some of that white privilege that is a buzzword now. I had a very privileged upbringing. I got to go to top schools. Nobody questioned that I had a right to be there. And, how does that perspective translate into viewing that everybody has to exist in this messy world together? And, the story is never just about one side or the other.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it's really refreshing and interesting to hear you, speak about your own identity and how it influences your work there. Because I sometimes wonder if, because there is a growing pressure with the way that culture is swinging and stuff, that you have to almost explain the reasons for why you do something. And I think art is definitely one of these subjects where creative freedom often sort of gets undermined. I think sometimes if we say that, one person can write this because they've had this experience and another person can't because they don't have that experience. I think that inevitably it has to come down to the artist's own ability to be empathetic, to do the correct research, and to not be disrespectful where they can. And I do think as well, as as much as it's brilliant you explaining all this as well, I hope you don't feel under too much scrutiny for telling a certain story.
No, I don't think I do, and I'm glad that I don't. But one thing I sort of see because having written a book, you sort of get into the publishing industry and you see what's out there and how it all works. And one pressure I see is there is a push to bring kind of diverse voices into the fiction writing world. There's even a hashtag on Twitter, own voices, let's get more books from own voices. But I think there's a bit of a danger in how it's playing out because, to take a step back, the publishing industry is under financial pressure because people are buying less books. They can't take much risk. So in order for a book to get published, it's got to be marketable. And what does marketable really mean? It's, okay, what's sold before so we can be sure it's going to sell again. That's why you've got 1 million books about World War II. And with the own voices movement, I feel that some of the books that have done well and so that have steered that genre into what they're looking for are they focus on own voice in a way that we want you to sound black and have that be what defines how you write. We want you to sound Asian And not only that, but the more you can make it exotic and different, and, you know, smell the spices, and, you know, feel the hot, humid temperatures and the tropics, and, you know, that sort of thing, that's what they like. That's what's going to sell, you know, other than sex and violence, which I tried specifically to keep out of my book. And with there, I think the danger is that might actually promote othering. That might actually, you know, you have diversity because, yes, you've got these different voices, and it's really important to keep all these different cultures and wonderful diversity alive and have that presented to the world. But if you have only diversity and you don't have a sense of inclusiveness and that we're all part of the same human race, you know, you can't get to where I think we need to go. So the inclusiveness part of it, again, back to those cultural representations, I want to take qualities and, you know, heroes that typically are associated with white people, and, you know, ways of being viewed as good and heroic that are typically associated with white characters, and say, no, black characters have every right to be human in that way as well. So it's a little different than the Own Voices movement that has been gaining traction in the publishing world. But I understand why that's going that way. I think that's important as well. I just want to have that kind of inclusivity and inclusion piece to go along with the diversity that's being pushed.
Yeah, I hear where you're coming from. Let's talk a little bit about Tewodros. How am I saying it? Am I saying it okay?
I think so. I think that's how I say it, Tewodros.
Tewodros. Okay, so fascinating story, and I appreciate as well historical fiction being a vehicle to explore real history. And I'd be really interested to hear about why you specifically chose the story of Tewodros and that period of history, elaborating on what you said earlier, and also your motivations for actually I wouldn't say manipulating history, but, you know, I won't give anything away, but there's an interesting, the ending took me by surprise and I thought it was brilliant. But then you also, you note that you have chosen to take an alternative approach to the actual history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the characters I have are not the actual historical figures. And, you know, for what we talked about earlier, I kind of did that on purpose, so I had the freedom to tell a story that I wanted to. But more specifically about that issue of cultural representation, there's actually been, you know, going back even to Shakespeare and Othello, there's been this idea in English language work, in English language literature, that yes, Black people are subhuman, they're not as good, they're other, but they can become good if they convert to Christianity, because that was all tied into, you know, we're bringing Christianity to the rest of the world, and that also justifies what we're doing in terms of colonialism and imperialism. But the unique thing about Ethiopia is that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was founded in the 4th century AD, which is about the same time that the Roman Catholic Church was founded. Britain at that time is a Roman backwater. So the history of Christianity and the Christian tradition in Ethiopia actually just goes back even further than it does in England. And so you've got a story where that kind of white savior narrative can't work. But beyond that, I wanted to turn it into a Black savior narrative. And here's kind of the crux of the book. You've got the English general Napier, and he's not the actual Napier who went to Ethiopia. There's been a couple Napiers in the English military and history, so I sort of took pieces of both of them and made this guy. He's feeling unfulfilled. He's got military victory, but that's not satisfying him. He's fallen away from his faith. He goes to Ethiopia and engages with this ancient tradition of Christian worship when he goes to the churches in Lalibela, and then he's witness to this, you know, the ultimate sort of Christian sacrificial act of Tewodros at the end of the book, and that triggers a conversion where he actually returns to his faith. He sees Christianity as something that can drive his destiny and drive the rest of his life and give him a purpose and fill the void that he's been experiencing. So he gets saved by Tewodros. And, you know, that turning on its head of the white savior narrative is in a way the core kind of plot point, the core message of the book. And it goes back to that same, we want these country cultural representations of Black people versus white people than what we've seen in literature.
Yeah, and that's so fascinating, that this idea that, yeah, you couldn't even use Christianity as a tool of colonizing savages when they've already got their own version of it. I'd be really interested to, I don't know much about Ethiopia's history, but I've heard, you know, here and there you hear things about the Ark of the Covenant, and I know that some of the churches in Lalibela are, you know, are very old, and I'd be really interested to hear a little bit about, yeah, the origins of Christianity in Ethiopia.
Yeah, and you know, that's my hope, is that if you read a bit about Ethiopia in a fictional book, you can find out more about the reality, because, you know, ultimately every person needs to be able to look back at heritage that they can connect themselves to and be proud of. And, you know, we had a great series come out on public television a couple of years ago in America called Africa's Great Civilizations, where Skip Gates, who leads African American studies at Harvard, you know, he's also got a popular show called Finding Your Roots, which helps people trace their ancestors back. But he himself said, growing up as a young Black man, I didn't know anything about African history. I didn't realize that there was history there that I could be proud of, civilization there that I could be proud of, that went back just as far as anybody else who told me that they could be proud of their civilization. So, you know, it goes back to the Aksumite kingdom. So Aksum was the capital of that kingdom. It's a city in Ethiopia still. They've got these monumental stone stelae that are still, some of them are still standing, you know, 50, 60 feet high. That King Azana of that kingdom was the one who converted to Christianity and promulgated it and started the Ethiopian church. And, you know, from there, it's like Europe. It goes through some down patches and dark ages, and then, you know, there's conflict and tension, and, you know, is it really all one country because there's so many political and ethnic divisions in it, or, you know, how did it get unified? And that same amazing history and culture is there throughout the same period of time. And, you know, it's a little bit dicey now because I think Ethiopia is struggling. They've got a constitution based on ethnicity, where the states are sort of set up based on ethnic groups. And you know, there's a bit of a power struggle between the largest group and, you know, who's actually running the federal government. And, you know, I hesitate to get into that because I know it's very sensitive for Ethiopians right now, and there's really strong feelings on all sides. So, you know, that in another way, it was again more comfortable for me to stay in a historical time frame to kind of talk about these things.
Yeah, I completely understand that. Why do you think the history of Africa has been so obscure?
So, you know, I would hope that if you're growing up in an African country and going to school there, you're going to learn your own history, just like it makes sense for us to learn our own histories in whatever country we grow up in and go to school in. So, you know, that I think there's too much to learn out there in the world, and how do you choose? But you're right that it seems less accessible, less available, less written about than maybe histories of some other places. And, you know, I don't know if that's part of the same, you know, one way to, you know, run your colonialist enterprise and take over new places and oppress people is to erase their history. If you know, if you can either paint them as subhuman, or, you know, you want to erase that history because you don't look very good in it, for one thing. And it helps your enterprise for another. That you see that happen all over the place. So I don't know if it's a legacy of that, or if it's just a matter of it's hard to get people to be interested about other places and other things than what's directly around them and affecting their lives. So again, I think that's hopefully fiction can present some exciting stories that draw people in, rather than just presenting history, which can be a bit dry, as something that they should look at and be aware of and understand. But certainly, I think it should be available to anybody who's interested in it, so that they can, if you're of African descent or heritage, be proud of where you came from.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's equally important for the diaspora in the Western world as well, because often the narrative is centered around transatlantic slavery, while also an important part of history. A lot of it's centered around victimhood, and I think it can sometimes contribute to the almost depression of people of color, around the world, if they're always learning about the negatives as opposed to the positives.
Yeah, you don't want to be defined by one thing that happened to people in the past. You've got to have that freedom and that entitlement, really, to step up and say, I can be anything, I can do anything. Which, to me, that's what white privilege in some ways really means. Is you grow up that way, you really do feel that the world is your oyster, you can do anything and be anything. And I think every young Black person should have that same feeling.
So what compelled you to start writing fiction then? Was there a moment when you knew that you just had to put pen to paper?
It took me a long time to write this book. I actually started back in 2010. I think it was just a bit of, you come out of university where you've had this opportunity to just think about anything you were interested in and go down rabbit holes and explore, why things are the way they are, how they could be, what have people said about this, what do I want to say about this. Then you graduate, and all of a sudden it's, for many of us, okay, I've got to put food on the table now. I've got to take a job where I don't really have space to do that thinking and to explore those things that kind of gave some passion to my life. And so it doesn't have to be a book, it doesn't have to be anything in particular, it could be reading instead of writing. But for me, it was, okay, I'm going to write about this, and that'll get me to think about it, and that'll give me an outlet and a way to kind of escape from the corporate day-to-day, and keep alive some of that spark of intellectual expansion that you get in uni, and that you have to make for yourself after you graduate.
Yeah, totally. That's why I think art in general is so important. I often think that art shouldn't, even if it's not something you embark on as a career, it's always something that you can do in your own leisure time. Is there any other kind of areas of history that you've wanted to explore through fiction?
So, I think there's other parts of Ethiopian history that I would also love to write about. There was an episode, I think, in the 16th century where a Portuguese explorer ended up going to Ethiopia and helping the emperor kind of defeat an insurrection in the southern part of the country. So again, that's just rich ground for telling a story kind of like Tewodros, and would love to do that. Other parts of the world, I've been interested in many of them. I actually got into Korean drumming in university and was sort of the leader of this Korean drumming troupe. That that form of art and drumming has also been used as a form of political protest in Korea, and we're exploring how to do that in the United States as well. Drumming in marches and putting on events where the performance kind of led people to also engage with political issues. And so randomly Korean history became interesting to me. And like I said, there's just so much out there. It's we're spoiled for choice. And I just, because of my love for Ethiopia and the time I spent there as a child, that's where I chose, and that's where I focused.
Yeah, that makes sense. You also mentioned that you spent some time in Haiti. Now, Haiti is the history of Haiti is something I'm fascinated in, and have dedicated a lot of my studies to, actually. I was just curious, if I don't know whether you're old enough or not, but whether you noticed a kind of culture of treasuring the Haitian Revolution while you were there.
I was a little too young, I would say, but at the same time, while I was there, Baby Doc, the leader, was overthrown and kicked out of the country, and a new government came in. So there was a coup, there was a rebellion, there was a revolution still happening when I was there, and I think that's maybe the legacy of that's part of their DNA. It's things aren't great. We're going to rise up. We're going to change it. We're going to try something else. And I think that's got to be part of everybody's culture. You can't ever be satisfied with the status quo. And I was just lucky that the two Afro-Caribbean countries I lived in, Haiti, the first Black republic in the world, and Ethiopia, the one African country never to be colonized. Just that being able to have that sense of pride in both those places was inspiring.
I can imagine. What I find really interesting about the Haitian Revolution is that often people reduce things to black versus white or whatever, but there is, like you're talking about, finding little interesting bits of history within the history. You might be familiar with the Polish battalion and the involvement of some white people defecting from the French army to fight alongside the blacks. And I think, for me, that stuff's really interesting. You just mentioning a Portuguese explorer going to Ethiopia, and I think you mentioned that he sided with the Ethiopians. I think, do you think those kind of stories where there's actually a unity between different cultures helps to sell the fiction more?
I see Marvel movies doing really well, and I sort of wonder, are we just doomed to have interesting and unique kind of stories like that be marginalized because that's not what puts people in the theaters or gets them to pull the book off the shelf. We're bombarded with so much now. It's like clickbait resorts to graphic things, and the more violence the better. And how do you fight those things that really do grab people's attention on a visceral level with more subtle and more gentle kind of stories that I'd rather be out there. And that's a challenge I don't know how to tackle. But having a platform like yours, Mandam, to talk about stuff like that, that's a great starting point. That's exactly what needs to happen, is to have alternative spaces where we can explore those stories, and it doesn't have to be all about let's maximize our commercial success.
Yeah. It's, of course, it's definitely a tough. Going against the Marvel universe is always going to be a big challenge. The competition's tough there, but you do see, as much as Game of Thrones and stuff also glorifies violence and all of that stuff. I do think humans, we do have an interest in history, and you do see history again and again being shown on film. So I think there is hope that with the right storytellers, we might be able to change the narrative. I was curious as to whether because you mentioned not wanting to glorify violence, and how much of that influenced your ending in Tewodros the King?
Again, we've got the crux of the book being this narrative of the Black Savior, and the saving is really the the religious sense of saving. And I actually was interested, as I'm reading Moby Dick, Melville points out that you look at the paintings in Italy from the Renaissance, and he's got these huge muscular men and like just oversized, brawny guys. But every picture of Jesus Christ is sort of a feminine, thin, in a way, not the traditional masculine picture of power, but that really is the sense of power in Christianity. It's that power that's going to triumph, and the meek will inherit the earth. And so that absolutely was part of what I wanted to present in terms of, this sense of power, and this biblical kind of concept of power in the New Testament is truly stronger, and that's the core theme of the book.
And was there actually a tradition of keeping sons of kings in caves during their childhood?
I think there is a monastery called Debra in Ethiopia, where it's kind of like this big plateau, and at the top there's some caves where the monks live, and I believe there were times when royalty was kept there for various purposes. So there's a grain of truth in that as well. The other piece was where I explored the kind of violence versus non-violence, was you had the British general going on a tiger hunt and shooting the tiger, and then you had Tewodros, and he was surrounded by all his retinue of people helping him do that, and you had Tewodros just out on his own with one guy thinking he wants to go and kill a lion, but when he gets down to the actual moment, he realizes it's more powerful for him to try and tame the lion and bring it with him and make it his pet, essentially. And that's just the contrast I wanted to show. And you do have a tradition in Ethiopia of the emperor keeping tame lions, especially black-maned lions, which still exists in a zoo in Addis Ababa that used to belong to Haile Selassie. So it's just, there's so many fascinating little details like that about Ethiopia that were a joy to bring into the writing.
I can imagine. Yeah, I can't imagine having a pet lion. Sounds a bit dangerous. I'd love to know as well about the Coptic Church and the selection of rulers as well, and how much truth there was to that.
Again, I think it's sort of that grain of truth. Anytime you've had a king in history, they've figured out that if they claim some divine right to rule, it makes them more legitimate. So I tried to twist that a little bit and use that blessing from the patriarch of the church as a way, again, in which the mechanism of putting something above the king, putting some law above the king himself, helped the country maintain its integrity even when he was passing on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that whole thread, because as we know, religion has always been the divine rule of kings has been such a powerful mechanism for manipulation. I don't know much about the Ark of the Covenant and the story there, but it'd be interesting to hear what you know about, or if you could help explain a little bit about its tie with Ethiopia and its history.
Yeah, no, my dad wrote a book about this called The Sign and the Seal, and it follows the Ethiopian tradition that the Ark was actually brought from the temple in Jerusalem to Egypt, where it stayed on an island in the Nile. Brought because the temple was being burned and destroyed, and they wanted to save it, and then eventually down the Nile all the way to Ethiopia, where it's safeguarded today. And there's a small church where the deacons are still on guard. No one's allowed to go in and see the Ark and tend to the holiest of holies, except the guardian himself. And it's just an amazing tradition that, if you look at if you look at the historical record, it's possible it's true. And that itself, that tradition has spread throughout the Ethiopian church, where each church itself keeps a stone tablet which represents the Ark of the Covenant, and on one festival each year they parade it around around wherever they are, and so the fact that they have the Ark is part of the fabric of their religion and their pride in their church.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm so keen to go to Ethiopia one of these days and see the churches as well. Are they sort of carved into mountains and stone?
Yeah, they're carved out of the rock. You know, they dug downwards and carved out the edifice of the church from the living rock there, and it's like nowhere else. You know, it's like it's not towering over you. It's opening beneath you, and the churches are down there, and you know they've got a network of tunnels and passages that connect them. And
wow.
I actually, unfortunately, while I lived in Ethiopia, the civil war was still going on. So it was too dangerous to travel to the north and visit Lalibela. But I too would love to just go back and see it for myself someday.
And how do you get down there?
Not having been, I'm not sure. I think there are stairways to get down, and it's not like ropes or ladders or anything, because it's part of a network of churches. There's not just one, and there must be access points where you come in, and then can get to the deeper bits.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in terms of structures, and we touched on earlier how there's almost there's been a bit of a demonization of Africa, and this reduction to Africa being a bunch of like mud huts and stuff. I think physical structures like these churches are so important in debunking some of the myths around Africa.
They are, yeah, and there are some, there's the palace of Fasilidas, Emperor Fasilidas in Gondar in Ethiopia is, it looks just like a medieval European palace. And, like I mentioned, the Stele at Aksum, those monuments are massive and impressive in the way that you see that in Egypt as well, with, the masonry, and the pyramids are in Africa, the most impressive structure on earth as well. It's there if you want to go find it.
Yeah, maybe once this pandemic is cooled down a little bit.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a few questions about the process of writing fiction. I know you started in 2010, and I mean, I think the art should merit whatever length it needs in terms of writing it. And what were some of the things that maybe kind of kept you going through those years of writing it? And do you have kind of any tips and advice for other historical fiction writers?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is a function of how much time you can carve out of the rest of your life to do this stuff, and part of it is a function of it's really hard to sit down and just write. You've got to have the inspiration, you've got to have the words come through, you've got to be in that kind of space where you're able to do it. But my advice is, perseverance will get you there. You just keep at it bit by bit. Even if you only write 2 sentences, 3 sentences in a day, you've still gotten closer to your goal. And eventually you will reach the end, and you can, no one can ever take away that work you've created by then. So it's a rewarding process along the way, because it gives you that ability to go into a different space and think a different way, and be connected to ideas and concepts that you don't deal with all the time. And at the end, it's ultimately rewarding because you've created something that, good or bad, it's yours, and you've put your expression out there.
And did you find yourself having to constantly refer to the history as you were writing it, or did you just have that historical knowledge stored in you to allow you to freely write?
No, I think you always need to go back and check yourself against against the history. And, again, depending on how close, you always have the choice of how close you want to keep to actual historical events. Do I want to even use the words that I know were spoken by certain characters and work that in, or do I want to kind of, write a book that's more, made up on the whole? So, just being aware of, I think setting that, if you're writing historical fiction, setting that parameter at the outset is important, because you've got to kind of choose the path and stick to it. And it's a very different book that comes out if you decide to do one versus the other.
Yeah, there's a great line towards the beginning of the book where I can't remember which character, but it's in when they're still in Britain. One of the characters talking about tending the empire like a garden, like explaining why Britain is so good, and in the sort of strange empire vernacular of describing a country as a garden. It feels like somewhat familiar. Is that borrowed from actual writings from the men of the time?
No, but maybe they said that. I'm glad. I have heard someone else say that when they read the book and its descriptions of the various places, it sort of rings true. And I think that was my goal, that it's something they definitely could have said, even if they didn't actually say it. But that was just me. I used to live down in Devon, drive around, and you see all the hedgerows in perfect sort of lines, and there's copses in the middle of the field, and the wind breaks, and everything's just been sort of, the landscape has just been structured and made into this sort of beautiful pattern by human activity. And then you go somewhere that's like the Ethiopian highlands, and it's just a complete wilderness, and yes, people are there, but they're living more in harmony with nature, and they haven't had to, in many places, go into the wilderness and tame it, because there's enough space everywhere else. And so that kind of contrast of just my visceral experience in both countries led itself to making that statement by that character.
Right. Well, I must say, I really enjoyed it. It's an amazing book, and I'm very grateful for you doing it, because I think, as we've talked about earlier, it's so important that we have more historical fiction narratives that are based in Africa, if only to inspire others, to take up the torch as well and continue to do it, because it is so important in how people of color around the world hold themselves, and don't carry around inferiority complexes. So yeah, thank you, and thank you so much for talking to me today as well.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure, and thank you for what you're doing in making a space where those kind of voices can be heard and those conversations can be had. And really enjoyed talking to you today.
Cheers, thank you very much. Everyone, get the book. It's a brilliant book. All right.
Thank you.
Take care. Lovely to speak to you.
Take care, mate.
All the best.